guest tonight is Ryan Dawson. He's the host of the ANC Report, Anti-Neocon Report, a web-based media outlet focusing on geopolitical, economic, and social issues. Ryan is a graduate of the College of William & Mary. He is the author of several books, including Welcome to the USSA, Corruption in the Government and Media, and Separation of Business and State. He's also a documentarian who has produced a variety of films dealing with a wide range of subjects, such as the Second Iraq War, 9/11, the anthrax attacks, covert operations of the Central Intelligence Agency, and the JFK assassination. Ryan, how are you doing tonight? How was that intro? Is that good?
That was a very good intro.
Well,
and I've got a new documentary coming out, Empire Unmasked.
When does that due out?
I'm hoping before September 11th of this year, just an arbitrary date for myself, but I think I'll finish it the end of this month. But then I got a review process. I'm going to let people give their feedback and then alter it some more, so I don't have 60 different versions of it like I did War by Deception.
Okay. And of course, if people want to support your work, can do that, right?
Yeah, they can. They can go over to ANC.com, ancreport.com right now, and there's a little button there where people can donate and get perks and sign books and DVDs and so on. That would help. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
We're over halfway there now. I got over the half mark yesterday on my birthday. Got past the halfway mark.
Oh, so good. Okay.
That was good.
What caught my attention tonight was recently was your article you posted, John Stewart Taking Down a Peg. It was an article that was, I guess, in response to his rant regarding the Confederate flag controversy that was stirred up by this latest shooting in that black church down in Charleston, South Carolina, by a young man whose, I guess, motivations were allegedly racist. You provide a revisionist analysis of the nature and causes of the so-called American Civil War. I guess let's start with the American Civil War. Let's start with that name. How do you feel about that name for that event?
Well, I'll say that too sometimes because it's just commonly what people call it. But my grandparents always called it the War of Northern Aggression. Some people call it the War for Southern Independence. And others say the Civil War, as if that's a more neutral term. But I think, the War for Southern Independence is more accurate, actually, than a civil war. There's certainly nothing civil about it. I know that's not what that means in that context, but saying the Southern War for Independence is what it was. And so I think that's a more accurate way to describe it.
That's because when the South chose to secede from the Union in the winter of 1860, 1861, they weren't looking to take over the North. They were looking to leave, get free of the central government. So they weren't trying to take power in D.C. They were trying to just declare their independence.
Well, right. I mean, Lincoln put a naval blockade on his own states, which is what kicked it off. But yeah, they were trying to declare independence. They hadn't even built the Navy. The Union inherited the Navy, and the Southerners were referred to as the rebels because everyone saw it as rebellion against the Union. I mean, they were trying to lead, and it wasn't the first time that American states had a secessionist movement. That had happened before in the Northeast as well, and nobody questioned the constitutionality of it at that time, back in 1814, all the way through the 1820s. There was the secessionist movement in the Northeast, and at that time, it was fine. Now they didn't succeed in seceding, but when they were doing it, nobody tried to claim it was unconstitutional, and Jefferson didn't send the army after them, and Madison didn't send the army after them. But it was over similar reasons. It was over the Embargo Act of 1807, which was playing off of the Chesapeake affair, where, if people remember the War of 1812, one of the reasons there was because the British were attacking American ships, merchant marine ships, and forcing Americans to become British sailors because they were at war with France in the Napoleonic Wars. And so as a response, the Americans limited trade to Britain and France, both, as a way of preventing Americans from getting captured and forced to become sailors, and to try and punish the British economically by suspending trade. That wasn't very popular, and it really hurt New England in particular, and Massachusetts in particular, and so they wanted to secede. They tried to negotiate a separate peace agreement with the British during the War of 1812 at the tail end. However, as they were doing that is when Andrew Jackson got his great victories in the South, so they ended up looking like buffoons. But they were trying to secede, and it was over the trade issues at that point in time as well.
And if I recall, Jackson's victory in New Orleans occurred after the treaty was signed, right?
Right, but the word hadn't gotten to them.
Yeah.
And they were trying to negotiate in the Northeast, like George Cabot and those guys were trying to have a separate peace agreement. And so it was similar reasons why. I mean, they were ready to secede from the Union, and before they were going to do that, they tried to issue constitutional amendments, and it failed, and the U.S. ended up winning that war anyway. But there were several reasons for the war in 1812, but one of them was that it was the trade restrictions. But as far as why northern states wanted to secede from the Union, it was absolutely over the trade issue.
And of course, the right to secession was sort of presumed because under the original meaning of the Constitution, the enumerated and specific powers, specifically lacking in that was the power to prevent secession. So there was no power granted to the federal government.
Well, right, and Jefferson and Madison were the consecutive presidents, and they knew that because they wrote the Constitution, so there was no debate about it.
And that was in the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions regarding
Right.
interposition and nullification, which South Carolina invoked later on. But as many as 3 states specifically mentioned secession in their ratification documents. I recall Rhode Island, New York, and Virginia, I believe, said specifically that should they ever perceive that the powers granted to the general government were being abused, they retain the right to secede from the Union. And that was not disputed, which meant by law that it applied to all the states.
Well, Lincoln really didn't care what the law was or the Constitution.
Yeah. Well, he had a crisis to deal with. What is it? This isn't a suicide pact, is it?
But I think people have to understand the Henry Clay's protective tariffs and the economic system to get a handle on what would end up happening before Lincoln got into office. And there was a long back and forth struggle with protective tariffs, and it really started with Alexander Hamilton. And the argument was, during the infancy, they need to protect industry from already established European industries, and the way to do that was through the tariff. Now, constitutionally, the tariff was for gaining revenue, not to protect certain industries. But Henry Clay saw it as a way to get revenue and to protect American industries. But by American, he means Northern American industries. And that's what ended up happening. They started selectively putting tariffs on specific goods like cotton and wool, etc., that were produced in the agricultural sections of the United States, which were all in the South at that time. So it really hurt them. But they raised the rate in 1816 to 20%, from 11% to 20%. And this was devastating. And this hurt the New England states and the South, but the Mid-Atlantic region was pretty much unharmed by it, and they gained a lot in industry, or so they thought. But it actually would have hurt them too. And this had been argued against it. They had first the 1860 tariff up to 20%. John Randolph opposed it from Virginia, and he made very articulate arguments of why that wouldn't work. And he talked about the competitive advantage that was written by Adam Smith on free trade and why free trade was better than mercantilism. But it continued anyway. And they tried to raise the tariff again in 1820, and this was a huge fight. John Taylor argued against it. He said this is going to reduce consumption. If you tax and put duties on imports, then that's going to raise the cost of those, and so consumers are going to spend less, and they're going to buy less for manufacturing because those prices will go up as they'll have regional monopolies and so on. And so that tariff failed. But by 1824, they finally got it pushed through, and they raised it 30% on a number of goods. Cotton was one of those. And it was very devastating. This is where you start to get the clear divide between North and South, because there were some Northerners that argued against it. Daniel Webster from Massachusetts argued against it. And a man he would end up debating with later, Robert Hine from South Carolina, they both articulated how you can't favor one economic sector over others. You can't favor industry over agriculture and commerce, but that's what they were doing. But when you look at that 1824 tariff, 47 out of 48 representatives from the South voted no. I think the one that was yes vote was from Tennessee. But 47 out of 48, pretty much unanimously against it. And this is what happened. So that passed in the latter half of 1824. And at that time, cotton was 21 cents a pound. And that's a lot of cotton for a pound. And by the next year, it was only 12 cents a pound. And by 1826, it had dropped to 8.8 cents a pound. So from 21 cents to 9 cents, basically a little less than 9 cents a pound, which devastated states like South Carolina in particular. The South was providing 80% of the cotton in the world, and about 100%, almost 100% of the cotton from the U.S. was from the South, and that was 80% of the cotton used in the entire world. And it's because of the Civil War that cotton producers in Egypt, and which became the new dynasties there, came to prominence and got their wealth, which led to a lot of geopolitical events all throughout the Middle East and Europe, was scrambling to find replacements for this cotton export. But that was another consequence of the Civil War. But for South Carolina, it was so devastating to have that industry scapegoated for the sake of northern manufacturers. And then in 1828, they raised it again. This was the worst. They were already talking about secession, and in 1828, it went from 32% to 50%. And the Senate voted 26 to 21 on that. But when you break it down, 94% of the South voted no. And also about 2/3 of New England voted no. So it wasn't clearly just North and South. It was the South and New England versus the Mid-Atlantic and West. And the Mid-Atlantic and West, of course, they all voted yes. And I mean, a 50% tax is insane. And everyone knows that. 50%, it broke everything. It was called the Tariff of Abomination. And that's when Calhoun, who was the vice president at the time from South Carolina, declared that states should be able to decide whether a law was unconstitutional or not. And this is where we get the process of nullification, which people are talking about today, trying to use nullification against things like the NSA. And he said the whole system of legislation imposing duties on imports, not for revenue, but for the protection of one branch of industry at the expense of others, is unconstitutional, unequal, and oppressive, and calculated to corrupt the public virtue and destroy liberty of the country. That was John Calhoun. And so through 1828 to 1832, that party of nullification party in South Carolina took control of the legislature. And so by 1833, once the nullification party took a majority, that's when they capitulated and say, okay, we'll lower the tariff back to the 1824 rate, which was still too high. I mean, it's like raising it and then raising it again and then only lowering it back to the first one that you raise it to. So the South wasn't having it. They were being broken by the 1824 tariff anyway. And so the 1828 was even worse. And people, apologists on the Civil War, like to point out, well, the tariff rate was the lowest it had been in 40 years. Well, yes and no. I mean, that's because they only lowered it back to what they had already raised it to. That's kind of like Obama cutting future spending. That's not a cut. You can't cut increases. Future, we're going to raise it by $4 billion. Now we're only going to raise it by $3 billion. That's a raise of $3 billion. That's not a cut of $1 billion.
Yeah.
And all they did was go back, and then they did agree to start reducing the tariff back down to 20%, which was still high, but they were going to get rid of that 30% increase because the tariff wasn't uniform. It was 37% on average, but on cotton and wool and iron and certain things, it was extremely high. And they wanted to cut that down to 20%. And it is in the Constitution that it should be uniform anyway. And so they made a compromise. They said, okay, over the next 2 years, in 2-year intervals, we'll lower it back down to there. But by the time Lincoln gets in the office, and this is also post-Mexican War, which has a lot to do with that. He raised the tariff 47%, so basically back to 50%, and they couldn't handle that, and they seceded. South Carolina seceded. But there are several southern states that hadn't, and Lincoln put a naval blockade on North Carolina, Virginia, and South Carolina to enforce the import and export tax. And that is why South Carolina fired on Fort Sumter, is because that was the U.S. Navy's fort that was enforcing the policing of this tax. And South Carolina said, we seceded, we're not part of the United States, so you can't collect taxes on us. You can't enforce these import-export taxes. And Lincoln said, I'm doing it anyway. And so they fired on Fort Sumter and took it over. And Lincoln had put a naval blockade up on 3 other states. And so Virginia and North Carolina seceded, because why is the Navy blockading them? They didn't do anything at all. And they were part of the United States at that time. And because of that blockade is what pushed them over the edge. Virginia seceded, and then North Carolina was the last state to secede and join the South. But had Virginia and North Carolina not seceded, there would not have been a civil war. I mean, almost 80% of the war was fought in Virginia, and the bulk of the Southern Army was from Virginia and North Carolina. Those were the most populous states at the time. Today, you can look at Florida and Texas as large states, but at that time, they were nothing. They were some of the smallest states. The largest state was Virginia, and then North Carolina. It's reversed today, but there wouldn't have been a civil war without that. And they all had different reasons for secession, but it was over this policy. And people bring up slavery as an issue, but you can look at the appeasement. The North was not trying to free the slaves. The North was trying to preserve the Union so that they could preserve their economic hegemony, which was clear. The Corwin Amendment was passed. It was introduced by 2 Northerners, one from Ohio, one from New York, which stated that it made a constitutional amendment that the federal government would not involve in the state's industry, including labor, which included slavery, that they were not going to abolish slavery. They were going to leave that institution in place. And this was passed, but it wasn't ratified because the southern states wouldn't ratify it. They seceded from the Union, so they couldn't vote on it. Now, in the Union's opinion, they were still part of the United States and weren't allowed to secede. So even though the Congress had passed it, to get a constitutional amendment, it has to be ratified by the states, and the southern states didn't ratify it. But Lincoln tried. He personally wrote the governors of each state's letters saying, here's this amendment. We're not going to oppose slavery. You can keep your slaves. And the South seceded anyway, because that was never why they were seceding to begin with. The tariff policy was the main reason, and offering them to keep their slaves didn't matter. I mean, they had a constitutional amendment already passed. All they had to do was ratify it. They could have kept every single one of their slaves, and there was still a civil war, and they still seceded. Not one single state took that deal.
Which is an important point, because offering to enshrine slavery in the Constitution, which is what the Corwin Amendment did, if the states were concerned, if the southern states were primarily concerned about preserving this institution of slavery, they would have taken that deal, and they didn't. Obviously, there were other concerns. So,
right. If they were, I mean, Missouri was maybe the one exception where the slavery was an issue there, but the reason the North was opposing slavery was, in Lincoln's own words, this is with Kansas actually as well, is that, if people remember Bleeding Kansas and that story, because that's the kind of high school thing you'll get, is they'll focus on this because it's the one thing that kind of supports their argument. Lincoln didn't want to expand slave states because he was a white separatist. And he did not want whites and blacks to mix. And he wrote this out. He said, if we can keep slavery out of Kansas, we keep blacks out of Kansas, Negroes, what he said. Yeah. And if you can keep them out, then you can keep the races from mixing. I mean, he was part of the Back to Liberia movement. He wanted to send blacks back to Africa. He supported that while he was a congressman, too. So it's not just something he said, as president to appease people. That was his life philosophy, long before the Civil War. He wanted blacks out. As part of the Illinois Constitution and the black code laws, that foreign blacks weren't even allowed to enter the state for more than 10 days. They wanted them out. They wanted a white America. Everyone was racist in the 1860s. And you can point to, this certain general and this certain colonel in the Southern Army said these racist things. Yeah, so that you can say the same thing with the Northern Army too. I mean, Grant himself had slaves, and he becomes the president, and he was the principal Union general. And Grant kicked Jews out of the treasury. I mean, there was plenty of racism, and of course, General Custer's, who infamously went west slaughtering Native Americans. And then post-Civil War, the Chinese were enslaved, and it was not indentured servitude; it was slavery, and they blew them up with dynamite and everything else.
Yeah.
Murdered them. I mean, and really, the Civil War is when industry took control of government completely. They completed their capture of government, and these
it's the beginning of the American oligarchy, I guess you could say.
It is a plutocracy, and it was an oligarchy. But it started with the railroads, in which Lincoln was a railroad lawyer. But
so was Sherman.
So was Sherman, and that's another thing. When people arguing about the Confederate flags and this and that, the North did lose more people than the South in the Civil War, and they lost more battles. But they also started with a lot more people. So percentage-wise, the South lost more, but about 250,000 of the deaths in the Civil War were Southerners, and their cities were burned. Most of them were civilians. It wasn't just their army, it was civilians, and a lot of people starved to death, which is how most people die in most wars up until modern times, was through starvation. And that's blacks and whites, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And Sherman just went through, he burned Atlanta. He wanted to make them out. He just burned cities. So people were joining the Southern armies to defend their homes. It wasn't about tariffs or slavery or anything. For a lot of people, it was, well, there's an invading army coming, and they're going to burn down our city, so I'm going to fight them. And that's anybody would do that. And so a lot of the Confederate veterans were defending their homeland from an invasion force. And that's what happened. The first shots of the Civil War after Fort Sumter, which was legit because they were taxing a state that was no longer part of the United States, was Lincoln sent troops down through Maryland. He wanted to protect D.C. And the 6th Massachusetts, at the time in Baltimore, the rail lines didn't go through the city. So they had to go down the northern Baltimore, walk through the city, and then get on another train and go south. And 6th Massachusetts was getting booed because they went down with guns and uniform to show their force, because they were worried about Maryland joining the South, which would mean D.C. would be surrounded. And the crowd was jeering them and booing them, and the Northern Army fired on civilians and killed 12 people. And then the civilians fired back and killed 4 Union soldiers. And the state song in Maryland, Maryland, My Maryland, is based on that event. It's a song about being fired on by the U.S. Army. But that's how Lincoln conducted things. He closed down newspapers. He wouldn't allow political dissent. He arrested people without trial, thousands of people, just threw them in jail.
He arrested the mayor of Baltimore, didn't he? And also closed the state legislature down, didn't he?
He did, and when he threw judges in jail. Say, oh, you don't agree? Well, you're going to jail. He just took the judge and put him in jail. He didn't care. He was the original neocon. And it's these guys from the railroad companies, Rockefellers, etc., and it's these Hamilton and Clay, the banking fanatics, that end up winning. Jackson and Jefferson and a lot of these Southerners had opposed that the whole time. But from Lincoln onward, the North and the banking families reigned supreme. And it was after the Civil War that they went west and completed the genocide of American Indians. And that, all through the 1890s, they slaughtered Indians. And at the tail end of that was 1898, which is the Spanish-American War, which was started by false pretext. And from 1898 to 1934, you had all the Banana Wars, where the U.S. was using military force to invade Central American states and Caribbean islands and set up military occupations. They occupied Haiti, they occupied Cuba, they invaded Honduras, they invaded Nicaragua, Guatemala, and so on, all through that period between 1898 and 1934. And it really was just an expansion. This Asian Pacific pivot they talk about, that's when the U.S. took the Philippines as well. It was part of the Treaty of Paris from the Spanish. So the Spanish-American War led to opening the doors for the U.S. to just have carte blanche to attack the South some more, to hit all the Caribbean and Central American states. They had already had 2 wars with Mexico, and Germans were supporting Mexico during World War One, so they weren't reinvaded. But basically, everyone else was openly done too. And from 1934 on, they switched to the policy of puppet governments instead of occupations. So as when Batista was put in power and so on, and you have the kind of corporate takeover style warfare with the United Fruit Company and so on. But I mean, that is not that long removed from the Civil War and the Indian Wars. I mean, Geronimo, which a lot of people probably only know from Bugs Bunny jumping out of a plane and yelling his name, was alive in the 1905 when the Wright brothers were flying the airplane. They were still putting Apache Indians on trains and shipping them to Florida to live in concentration camps. And these were men who were alive during the Civil War.
Yeah, it's just a generation or so. Yeah,
it's just they're older now, but I mean, those people were alive during Reconstruction and so on. I mean, that was their policies. This is what it led to: just unabashed militarism and empire.
And first I'll make an observation, but going back to South Carolina and the nullification crisis, that's a testimony to the right of secession, because when they threatened to secede, I know Jackson tried to push through a force bill, but I guess Henry Clay stepped in and negotiated. The threat of secession led people to negotiate to lower the tariff, to make it less destructive. So
it worked in a way.
Yeah.
They started taking it down in 2-year intervals, and there was a period there, but the real reason, and just this is my opinion, nullification threat, was a threat enough to say, all right, we're going to lower this tariff. But the real reason was the Mexican War. Who fought that war? The South.
Yeah, the generals.
It was the Tennessee Volunteers and so on. And this is the ironic thing, too. Robert E. Lee was involved in that and was instrumental in defeating Mexico. At that time, it wasn't like now. It was much more even. I mean, Mexicans had cavalry and the same kind of guns and all that. They just got out-generaled. And that war was over regional scapegoating as well. Mexico had only been an independent country for 11 years. They had won their independence from Spain. And in year 11 of that, the northern half of Mexico, which included Texas at the time, was angry at the southern half because the southern half was taking all the taxes and spending it in Mexico City and the southern side and ignoring the region up north. Now, really, the region up north wasn't really part of Mexico other than on paper, because it was still completely controlled by American Indians, but they just sort of drew a map and said, this is ours. Yeah. But that part seceded and ended up trying to set up its own state, and then later join the Union with the United States because of the United States Army and the Texicans and Northern Mexicans fighting the Southern Mexicans. But it was the General Lee, well, he wasn't a general at the time, but he would become a general, but it was Robert E. Lee and also Northern generals fighting to take territory away from Mexico, which became a slave state, by the way. So at that time, it was okay for the United States to take more territory from another state through force and make a slave state. And then they also created California, which used to be part of Mexico. So you could argue, hey, is that flag, that California flag or that Texas flag, racist? Because Mexico abolished slavery in 1829, right? And yet now their territory joined a slave state. The United States still had slaves. And the North had slaves too, by the way. I mean, 5 Northern states had slaves during the Civil War, and you could have private slaves. And there were also freemen in the South. So it wasn't like clearly like, oh, across this line, there are no slaves. And that completely bogus. And it also worked against too, because why would the North have 5 slave states if they're fighting against slavery? And during the Emancipation Proclamation, he only freed slaves in the South, not in the North. And that was more about keeping the British out of the war than anything else. And then the Civil War didn't even free the slaves. The 13th Amendment did. And 3 northern states refused to ratify it, and only 1 southern state refused. So you just lost 600,000 people in a war to free the slaves. And now here's the amendment to free the slaves, and 3 northern states vote against it? No, of course not. But of course, the war wasn't about slavery.
Yeah, and of course the New England, it was the New England shipping companies that made money shipping the slaves across the Atlantic Ocean before the international slave trade was shut down.
by a Southerner.
Yeah, and it was that capital from the slave trade.
Slave trade. And
Yeah,
it was the American flag on all those ships. The
yeah,
American flag was also designed by racists who owned slaves. The Ross family had slaves, but that's not. No one says the American flag represents slavery, even though they had slaves for so long in such a long period, or genocide, even though that continued after the Civil War too, and genociding American Indians. I mean, they murdered them, and when they lost in war, they salted the lands and started shooting the buffalo to starve people to death. I'm going to tell you something about General Custer because this just disgusts me to no end. He's a cavalry general in the Union Army. He ends up leading the charge and slaughtering people at Wounded Knee. And this guy, they used to sell young Indian women to crowds of cowboys to be raped as sex slaves. They would put them up, strip them naked on the stage. I mean, girls as young as 10, and sell them in auctions to gangs. What the gangs would do is they would all buy one girl together. They'd pool their money and buy her and rape her to death in Custer's corrals. And he personally had Indian mistresses that he would fornicate with nightly until his wife moved out there. And of course, he ended up getting killed, and they make him out to be this hero in the Wild Bill plays and all. And then later, the Hollywood westerns and the Indians were like Arabs today; they're completely demonized. And
dime store novels, yeah.
And it's stories. Oh, it was Custer's hubris. He tried to kill too many Indians. Like, well, yes and no. Crazy Horse had actually went around Custer and cut off his supply lines days before and set up this battle. Custer was running out of water and ammunition, and he had to attack because had he waited, he would have lost everything anyway. He got forced into that battle, but they never give the American Indians credit for the generalship and how they had outsmarted them. They just had to blame it on Custer's hubris instead, which is just sort of a crass and stupid look at history. It's just ignoring the weeks prior to Little Bighorn. But, I mean, these guys did not care about blacks or Indians or slaves or human rights or anything like that. The North wanted to preserve the Union, and Lincoln made that very clear. He stated if he could preserve the Union without freeing slaves, he would. If he could do it by freeing slaves, he would. And if he could do it by freeing some and not others, he would. That his principal purpose was to preserve the Union. They didn't give a damn about blacks. The largest race riot in American history was in New York City during the Civil War. You had the draft riots, they were called, but they went around lynching and hanging black people. And it's like that today. I mean, New York cops can choke black people on film and get acquitted by the state, but no one goes after the New York state flag for that.
The worst race riots in the 60s were in Detroit and L.A. and D.C., not in the South. So
of course it was. And, I mean, there were Jim Crow laws, which were not just against blacks, it was against the poor, because there were literacy tests. And, to repeal the Jim Crow laws, they actually used Confederate flags in their movement. And the Mississippi Freedom Party, which was endorsed by Martin Luther King, had a Confederate flag with a white and black hand doing a handshake. Mm-hmm. It was considered, we are rebelling against the establishment, because the establishment was pro-segregation. And the rebels wanted to desegregate. And again, the Confederate flags came out. And people also like to say, oh, the Confederate flag was added to South Carolina and Alabama during the Civil Rights Movement against blacks. No. The Confederate flags were added because it was the centennial of the Civil War. It was 1961, the war was from 1861, and it was the 100-year anniversary. That's why they did it. It was nothing to do with the civil rights. The civil rights movement was using the flag itself to rebel against segregation.
But the American expansion, you could say that the people that perpetrated the slaughter of the American Indians, the Plains Indians, they were bloody during the Civil War, though. Like the Buffalo Soldiers, the vaunted Buffalo Soldiers, they were sent west to go wreak havoc out west, correct?
Sure. Well, also the Cherokee Nation also seceded, and they said they weren't part of the Union anyway, but they did secessionist papers and broke with the Confederation. They had their own Confederation and fought on the side of the South. And so they were targeted. which is ironic too, because they'd already been put on the Trail of Tears, you know.
Oh
And
yeah, Jackson.
they
Yeah.
still saw it. They knew that these Northern Railroad industrialists, once they got their roads going west to connect with California, everything in between was becoming white and American, and they were going to get killed. So they fought on the side of the South. They're really fighting on the side of themselves, obviously. But they saw that here's a nation that doesn't abide its constitution, and this is very dangerous.
Mm-hmm. And there again, there's nothing inherently wrong with building railroads, extending transportation, modernizing, but when you throw all morality aside, all sense of justice and fair play, and basically if you can do what you want to the people that are already there, you can kind of make them pay. You can externalize the cost.
Well, America had built all its canals and railroads through private investment and entrepreneurs. But with Lincoln, it became mercantilism. This is the merger of state and business, where they are just start subsidizing certain industries at the expense of others and creating monopolies. And you see that today with drug companies and weapon companies. Lockheed Martin's 90% of its business is from the U.S. government. And we pay drug companies through agricultural subsidies, where they will give farm subsidies to ranches and farms, but a large portion of that money goes to pay for pesticides and antibiotics and all these steroids and so on from drug industries. So it's really an indirect subsidy for big pharma, but selectively so. And they selectively enforce copyright law to favor the establishment industries, so that upstarts and innovation just gets swallowed up and rewarded to Dow, Searle, and Chemical, and the companies, DuPont especially, because they have a lot of money and they can influence government to do that. And you really saw that with the Commerce Clause, and the railroads, go across several states. And so this was a pretext for the federal government to grab more power and reward money to them. And but that, putting tariffs up to 50%, as they did in the Tariff of Abomination, that really got the ball rolling for nullification and threats. And after the Mexican War was settled and Texas was a state and they were talking about going west, Lincoln reinstituted the tariffs. And everyone knew, he wasn't even on the ballot in southern states, and he still got elected to become president. The North knew that they had a larger population and they could vote themselves money at the expense of everyone else. The South was only 25% of the population, and they were paying 80% of the taxes. How does a quarter of the country pay 80% of the taxes? If that happened today, there would definitely be secession.
And of course, those tax payments are subsidizing the very things that are undermining the Southern economy.
They were, and also it came out of the blue because a lot of things were bought on credit, and the South made money seasonally when whatever crop they're growing sells. Hey, and so if you bought whatever textiles or piano or something, and then all of a sudden this large tariff comes and 15%, and cotton's dropping down to 9 cents from 21 cents in 2 years, and then they couldn't pay. And another thing that exacerbated this was the Second Bank of the United States, through inflation, caused a depression, and that was the pretext for creating the new tariffs. So if we create these new tariffs, we can get out of the depression. Well, it just made it worse, obviously, but that was caused by the banks, and the South was prospering well. But the Europeans were buying goods from the South, not the North. The Europeans had already established their factories and manufacturing base. They're not going to buy from the dinky American one, but they were buying cotton, tobacco, and agricultural crops. And the North was jealous. They didn't want the South making money. They didn't want them to prosper. They wanted their own manufacturing industries to prosper. And they had for a time during the War of 1812, because all exports were banned. And that was a time where American industry did grow because they had to sell internally. But it was also trying times for everyone. The basic, living standard dropped considerably. It really hurts consumers to arbitrarily give somebody a monopoly. And the other thing with the tariffs was compounded by Europeans putting tariffs on the United States. So not only did they have a 50% tax and then later down to 28%, or 20%, which is still way too high, they couldn't export their goods either because Britain and France started putting tariffs on the United States. Well, what were they buying from the United States? cotton, tobacco, and agricultural products. So again, the South couldn't sell its goods, and it couldn't buy manufactured goods from Europe either, which forced them to have to buy internally and on credit and without being able to make revenue themselves because they were so reliant on exports. And so it's no wonder that obviously the war starts in South Carolina, and it starts by firing on at a port where they collected the money.
Now,
It
of
did
course,
start at a slave plantation. Now,
yeah.
there were people that went around trying to get slave owners to support the war effort for the simple fact that they had money. So they started preaching slavery, this and that, to try and get their financial support. But, you know, 2/3 of the South didn't own slaves, and most of them, mostly it was just state pride. I'm from Virginia, and I'm going to fight for Virginia. Things like that. That simple, that basic. It's just like that now. I mean, look at people in sports teams or whatever.
Yeah,
Regionally loyal. And the North came down to Bull Run, you know, with a big invasion force and got repelled twice. And people joined because they just identified with being a Southerner. It wasn't even a particular ideological thing. Now, the government obviously started wars over the tariff policies and things and trade, but the basic soldier was there because that's where they were from, and they were fighting for that. And the Confederate battle flag becomes a symbol of rebellion and Southern identity post-war during Reconstruction, because you have to understand, 250,000 people were killed. Entire cities had been burned down. Their rights were taken away after the war, even after the assassination, and then it got worse. And they had to rebuild from nothing. And this really set the South back decades in terms of education and other matters because nothing was there. The schools were gone. Their infrastructure had been taken away. They had to start over. And then they had to deal with carpetbaggers and everything else. And so they bonded as a unity of, you know, we fought for our independence. We didn't get it, but we made it through this. We made it through Reconstruction, and they saw that battle flag as a way of sticking it to the man, as saying, look, the concessions they did get was because they fought. You know, they didn't want another civil war. Lincoln started to capitulate at the end. They needed to reunify. They needed to heal. That's why Thanksgiving all of a sudden got changed into what it is today. You know, brotherly family love. Although, you know, the original Thanksgiving was celebrating the Mystic River massacres, also in the north of American Indians. That got changed by Lincoln. And they, you know, they got Robert E. Lee to go out and try and reunify the country, start trying to heal. But it was the battle flag, not the Confederate flag, that people flocked to because they supported those who had fallen, the soldiers. And the United States government recognized Confederate soldiers as U.S. veterans. And that's why it bothers me deeply. I don't like desecrating the dead, period. I don't care who you are. I don't even care if it was a Stalinist, communist, or a Nazi or whatever. You don't mess with the dead. And we've got people desecrating graves now of U.S. veterans because in their mind, they're racist. As if the Union Army wasn't also racist. You know, they were all racist, pretty much. It was the 1860s. You could have done that 100 years later, they still would have been racist. Look at the propaganda in World War II toward the Japanese. Or, I mean, it is just unapologetically racist. And again, for American Indians, for Chinese, for Vietnamese, the Korean War, etc., they demonize the enemy. And racism is one of those tools. And does catch you, even now. If you goddamn Arabs and da-da-da-da, you get a lot of racism in Blackwater and these mercenary armies, and a lot of religious bigots, too, that want to kill Muslims because 9/11 or something, collectively condemn the whole faith or the whole race, whatever, because that does happen now and it happened then. But I wouldn't go spray paint, even though I've opposed every single one of these wars. I would never go to a soldier's grave and write racist on it. Never. Even if he was a racist, still wouldn't do it.
Yeah, just you don't speak ill of the dead, you know.
You don't speak ill of the dead, and you don't know who that person was at all anyway. And you just can't do that. And people are doing that, and it's getting out of control. And what I see coming down the line as a consequence of this is there's going to be a big backlash. When you go around, I mean, when you're attacking historical monuments, memorials, graves, a deep part of American history. And I grew up in the South, and I saw the Confederate flag my whole life. I never saw associated racism until about the 1990s, when the NAACP declared war on it. They needed something to do. And you started getting these HBO specials where skinheads and stuff would have the Confederate flag. And I'm like, why do they have the Confederate flag? What's that got to do with neo-Nazis in Germany? Like, what? And it was because of this race narrative. Like, the North was just the good guys that went to free blacks from the yoke of oppression, which is just laughably inaccurate.
Well, yeah, if you look at the South itself, after the Civil War, you have this brutal war that rampages, the Union Army rampages through the South, burning cities, destroying farms, countless thousands probably starving to death in the process that aren't really war crimes. And then you have the brutal occupation, Reconstruction, corrupt occupation. Then when the whites finally reassert themselves, obviously you're going to have a reaction to that. And not to put any blame on the North for the conditions in the South, people just completely forget about that. How for a better part of a century, the U.S. government did nothing for blacks. In fact, it worked against their interests, particularly with the Davis-Bacon Act and much of the New Deal legislation.
Worse than that, what they started doing is they purposely impoverished the South, and they shipped black workers up north to bust the unions. When the North started to unionize and for the movement in labor, they started bringing blacks into these Rust Belt towns to undermine the labor and break the strikes.
Giving them no housing, by the way, destroying ethnic neighborhoods in the process, and wondering why there's fighting.
Reversed it later and pushed all the blacks back out and rehired the whites once they gained control of the unions through organized crime. They did not care about any particular race or people. These people work for profit, period. They spun the war during the 1960s is when the Civil War became about slavery, because race was the popular theme. But I mean, still people were using the Confederate flag to rebel against the war in Vietnam. They had the battle flag shaped like a peace sign, and there were movements because, again, it was a disproportionate number of Southerners who died in Vietnam. That's who got sent to Vietnam, blacks and poor whites, or poor blacks and poor whites, disproportionately. And then with some of those whites were actually Latino, which got categorized as white in the war, and probably weren't. I don't think you need racial statistics on stuff like that, but whatever. I mean, and it's men too, obviously, but it was poor people who got sent in the war. It's always poor people dying in a rich man's war. And even during the Civil War, it was Irish conscripts and things. People were fleeing the potato famines and coming to North where, there were other Irish immigrants prior, and they got conscripted in the army and promised land and money. And of course, it was never delivered. They were just used as cannon fodder. And the Irish and the Chinese were both used to build railroads. And part of the motivation for ending slavery was not altruism. It was just more cost efficient to have wage slaves than it was cattle slavery. They did the right thing for the wrong reason. They didn't care about anybody.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned earlier, the Civil War itself was the creation of the formations of what you call the American plutocracy, oligarchy, with the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, and and you have where they begin to monopolize a lot of these things, where they develop, they take over, they start opening.
And all under some pretext of altruism, like, oh, we're going. I mean, you see it today. We're going to liberate women in Afghanistan. We're going to Libya for humane purposes, or whatever.
Well, philanthropy, right?
Kurds in Iraq.
Yeah.
It's just total disingenuous garbage. It's for resources. It's for power. It always is. But
it's like what they call it, the Powder Trust in World War I with the DuPonts, where they amassed these fortunes off the carnage of World War I, and they leveraged that wealth politically. And that's what the Rockefellers did. When they went into banking, like you mentioned.
That's a good point.
And they opened up universities. They changed history and historical. Now they took over the American Historical Association, started hiring their own professors, and this is where they hired Ivy Lee and Edward Bernays, and they went into they got into media, radio.
And the Civil War had always been taught as having multiple causes, and they went over the tax and tariff policies and all of it, and that got changed later. It just became slavery.
Well, the biggest thing is, you alluded to it, is this tactic where they started using philanthropy as cover for their misanthropy. Well,
exactly. We're invading Grenada because communist.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Latin America's you because you've written a lot on it. Also Africa, for that matter, is where it's where.
Oh yeah, neocolonialism. I did a video on that too, actually. we didn't mention in the beginning. It's called, I don't have a clever title. It's just called Neocolonialism in Africa.
Yeah.
But absolutely, like with Zambia, et cetera, and the copper mines owned by Glencore, and the U.S. aid to Africa, and the loans are predatory loans. They're not to help poor Africans like in the commercial. Oh, look at this starving kid. Don't
They're
you
doing
want
them.
to?
Hey, they're doing it domestically too. Student loans.
Yeah, but not as bad as Africa.
No, it's not
But yeah,
as
but
brutal.
student loans,
Yeah.
guaranteed loans, just increase tuition. People say, shouldn't college be affordable for the poor? I'm like, yeah, but now you've made it unaffordable for everyone.
It used
Because
to
the
be, by
person
the
that
way.
saved money still can't go to college unless they get a loan too,
Yeah.
because guaranteed loans, and I mean, some of them are more than like $80,000, more
Yeah.
than that, 100,000
And at the same
to go
time,
to
they've
school.
deindustrialized the
Look, you got
economy.
$100,000, you should just leave.
Yeah.
You're good. You're good for several years, easily. Just go start a business.
Yeah.
If you got 100 grand, just keep it. Like you won.
Yeah, but it's kind of funny as how these elite interests bought out like the civil rights movement, like the NAACP and a lot of these black politicians, where they're more or less the tools of the elite, because it's kind of similar what they do in
They don't
Africa.
care about blacks. I mean, these organizations, a lot of these charity organizations, this is what happens to them too. It's the way Occupy or the Tea Party or any other modern movement gets hijacked by lunatics,
Hmm.
and you get these race hustlers that the NAACP started with legit reasons, but it quickly just
Yeah,
it doesn't further interest for minorities at all.
but didn't
And
Edward Bernays, wasn't he a founding member or something? I was like, what would he have to do with that? I mean, like, so you know,
well, yeah, I mean, all these organizations start with a lofty sounding purpose, and they
yeah,
quickly get taken over. I mean, even the Red Cross, which did good work in the beginning, the modern Red Cross, you look at the disaster in Haiti, how much money they spent to build, what, 12 houses or something? I
hmm
mean, the money's just squandered because no one looks at it. And that's the thing is if you can attach yourself to some unquestionable good thing, like we're doing this for education, we're doing this for the environment, we're doing this to help this minority group or women or something like that. Everyone's like, oh, I'm for that. Of course I support that. And but that's just a theme, you know. They're collecting money to pay off superintendents in a large bureaucracy, or they went into Haiti, but it was more or less just a way of enriching themselves, and very little of it actually goes to the people they supposedly are there to help.
same
And,
thing with Doctors Without Borders.
which is
It's
sad.
yeah.
The Red Cross was used as a pretext against the Soviet Union too, but
Well, yeah, NGOs, the whole NGO meme or strategy,
yep.
against in the
And
Russia
but you
today.
can't
Yeah.
categorically reject them. You have to look at NGOs and charity organizations on a case by case
Hmm.
basis. But I can tell you, like pretty much all the real big, big ones you know of are bad, are corrupt, because the government takes control.
Yeah. And the moment
If
you
people
find,
understood the tariff policies of the Civil War, I don't think they would be so confused about TPP and why that matters.
mhm.
But people just don't understand. Like there was no income tax, right? In the United States, we still had roads and schools and a post office and everything without an income tax, but there were large taxes on tariffs. But you had a quarter of the population paying 80% of the taxes, and that is why they wanted to form their own set of nations. And the Confederate Constitution, what they changed is that Article 1, Section 8, where they got rid of the general welfare clause, because they wanted duties to be uniform, so that you couldn't specifically tax a certain type of good. It would just have to be on goods, not just cotton or just wool or what have you. And they added a line item veto, and they set term limits, all stuff that we support today. But they had it back in the 1860s.
Well, coming up on a final, I guess, 6 minutes of our interview. So the American Civil War, misnomer. Obviously, we covered that. It was
Sure.
obviously war for Southern
I
independence.
want to say something about the flag too,
Yeah,
because
yeah, good. Just
they're
because
going
it
out of
relates to this
control.
flag
Like
controversy. Go
they're
ahead.
ruining my childhood here, taking it off the Dukes of Hazzard and things. And this is like this. I mean, it's been everywhere. It was like it's an entertainment. You had Leonard Skinner and Kid Rock and musical bands that had it forever. Like Kid Rock was a top-selling musician in the late 90s, early 2000s, and had Confederate flags in his music videos. He had them in his concerts, and no one said a thing. And he sold records north, south, wherever, and it wasn't an issue yet. He had Stone Cold Steve Austin in professional wrestling with it, and no one said he was racist or anything. It was just he's from Texas, it's just a southern thing. Then you had shows like the Dukes of Hazzard, which was, again, I'm just naming stuff that were top selling things, because Kid Rock was, Stone Cold was, Dukes of Hazzard became the show for its time period. It was the most widely watched many seasons, and that was based on real people from North Carolina, and they had the Traveler was the General Lee. General Lee's horse was named the Traveler, and that was in the car when they were bootlegging. And so Bo and Luke, it was set in Georgia, but it was based on real people from North Carolina that actually did that, who were cousins and all that. And so they had the General Lee, and there was a Confederate battle flag on it, and no one paid no mind. There's absolutely nothing racist in that show. The show was about bucking the law, and it was
corrupt local officials,
boss hog and corrupt politicians and cops trying to take the Duke farm, trying to take the land away. And so, as part of Southern culture and rebellion and independence and self-sufficiency, they were having none of it. And they had wholesome values, and they were Christian. They prayed before they ate and things like that.
And they were bootleggers.
They were bootleggers, yeah. Or Jesse had been. They were trying to become race car drivers or something. Whatever. It was a fun show. And Daisy Duke, of course, she invented Daisy Dukes. It's part of our culture. I mean, Daisy Dukes exists because of Daisy Duke. That woman, Catherine Bach, designed those booty shorts. And, they all went on to do different things. Cooter became a congressman in Virginia. He was the mechanic in the show. And
Ben Jones,
Yeah, Luke became a country star and so on. And, Bo was from New York. Lied about where he was from, lied about his age. He got the part. But he was great as Bo Duke, and named after Beauregard, and they couldn't find anything racist in that show. But they just said, well, the flag's just a symbol of racism, even though there's absolutely nothing portraying racism in it. They're just like, well, it's the flag, right? We're like, well, obviously, you have all these many decades of Southern culture and music and entertainment and television shows, etc., with this flag as a symbol of rebellion and as a symbol of Southern heritage forever. And that is clearly how a lot of people see that flag and have used that flag there's tons of examples. But it's because they put the microscope on the Ku Klux Klan and idiots like this. They're like, see, they're racist and they have this flag, therefore that's what the flag is, the meaning. And yet the Ku Klux Klan also has American flags. They also have a Christian cross. And I'm not a Christian, but I know that that's not what the cross represents.
Yeah.
But you could make an argument that actually that symbol's killed more people than all the above. But
yeah,
Christians today, normal Protestant, Catholic, whatever, that live in America, do not want to lynch people and hang them. And that is extreme. And the Klan, the uniform is the shape of a cross. And they have a burning cross. That is their symbol, And then some of them go around with everything from Confederate flags to German swastikas and stuff. They're idiots. They don't get to own any of those symbols, the cross or the stars and bars or any of that.
Well,
they just
half of them are probably federal agents anyway.
Most of them are FBI, and most of them are in the North. They're more skinheads in New Jersey than there are any state. New Jersey also rejected ratifying the 13th Amendment too. I mean, they shouldn't. The hell with those people. They don't get to take the flag. And I hope more Southerners, and a lot of people don't want to get accused of being racist, so they hide from this, but it would have been perfectly fine to have a rally of Confederate supporters to go against the Klan and the Black Panthers. They're both racist organizations, and I hope that happens. But it should have been up to the people of South Carolina to decide about the fate of their own flag without pressure from all these other people that don't live there, have no idea. These millennials grew up on the internet and they see memes and stuff. I saw I lived in Virginia, where most of the Civil War was fought, and from Fredericksburg through to just Shenandoah, whatever, there are battlefields, memorials, museums. They're everywhere. And you see Confederate flags on the back of a truck, a bumper sticker, just at someone's house, whatever. And it's just I'm a Southerner. That's what it's always meant. and they're black people with them too. They're everybody. I had an uncle who was Chinese, and he loved it. He had a Confederate flag in his business forever. He was very hardcore American because he left communist China, you know. And anyway,
Well,
it's
I think the whole point is a cultural agenda, or corporatist agenda, where they're trying to destroy any idea of local identity, local patriotisms, to create this
well, they want to divide.
monoculture. And yeah, there's a divide and conquer strategy there too, and they're doing that.
They want to divide people, and they knew that would piss off millions of people, which it did. But they're always going to put the camera on the racist.
Oh yeah, they're never, they'll
you know, that's why I put my flag back up and said, look, I'm not going to let you steal this symbol. A lot of people died fighting the corporatocracy from under this banner, and I understand their reasons, and they fought to protect their own homeland. And even though I oppose the Civil War, I pretty much oppose nearly every war, I still honor veterans. And I think when you're attacked, because that was a war where we actually got attacked, and of course you can't negotiate for peace while you're being attacked or occupied. Like I can understand why Hezbollah or Palestinians fight Israelis. I can understand why Crazy Horse killed Custer. I would have supported the war for their side, but not the war of aggression. And that's what the Northeast did. It was pure aggression and pure greed, and had nothing to do with wanting to free slaves. There were abolitionists, to be sure, and they lived in the North and South, but they were not in charge. That is not what happened with the war of Northern Aggression.
I think it was the late Murray Rothbard who said the American Civil War, as he phrased it, or the war between the states, was the last just war fought in the United States, and that was, he said, and the wrong side won. So
right, yeah. I mean, he pointed out Rothbard had looked at arguments from John Randolph and others who had already articulated it very well, Heyman and others, what was going on, you know, how free trade was the superior policy, and that this mercantilist system was just favoring certain industries and dividing the nation, and led to nullification ultimately, which they're scared to death of. And another thing that this battle does is it discredits the idea of nullification, because that comes from South Carolina and it comes from John Calhoun. And we're trying to use nullification against the NSA right now. And it's states' rights that I know there was just a Supreme Court decision about homosexual marriage, but what people have to remember is that was already legal in several states. And the same with legalizing marijuana, which is still not a federal thing. The reason it's legal in Oregon and Colorado and Washington State and Washington, D.C. is because of states' rights. It's because the state can say, well, we don't agree with the federal government, and we're going to make these things legal in our state. That process happened much earlier because of states' rights. If you have to wait until the federal government makes it a sweeping law, you can wait for a very, very long time. And it's because of states' rights that the federal government ends up doing it. It's because certain states start break away and show, look, we legalized pot and hell didn't break loose, you know. Because states can do it first is what puts the pressure on the federal government to do it eventually anyway. Mm-hmm. And without the states doing it first, the federal government usually won't do it. I mean, whether you agree with it or not, states can decide whether or not they're going to have this law or that law and what's constitutional. And it's a better way, and it's a faster way towards progress. And it keeps them at bay. It divides the power. There's a great letter between General Lee and Lord Acton about that, where General Lee predicts, he says he's afraid that if the Union wins the war, that the course is going to be imperialism abroad and domestic despotism at home. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, Lee predicts the 20th century.
He predicted the 20th century.
Robert. In 1867. 1866 about, yeah. Amazing. Well, Ryan, I want to thank you for coming on tonight. That was great. It's a very complex and interesting topic. Your article is a very succinct treatment of it, and I recommend it to everybody.
The articles are better. I mean, I can't memorize all those facts, but I haven't gotten into the Civil War for a long time. My brother knows it inside and out, and I know a lot from him. I have a twin. It's all about that. I'm much more into the Middle East and other things, but I mean, I understand economics, and so I could read it and listen to him, and I get it. But I'm not a Civil War historian like Mike Scruggs or Thomas DeLorenzo or these guys that specialize in this issue. But just from looking around Facebook and stuff, I go, well, I seem to know a lot more than most.
Well, because you bother to crack a book, so that gives you a head up.
Right. I've read books about it, certainly. When I was a little kid, I mean, I sided with the North. I was like, okay, yeah,
Well, same
that's
with me. I mean, I didn't hear any about this stuff. I said, North won, where it's America, we're always good, blah, blah, blah. Rah, rah,
yeah,
USA, USA. That's how,
cheerlead for the team. But
yeah.
I grew up, and I think a lot of people can't. They need that crass generalization where it's just some stupid good versus evil narrative where we went to do this. And, No, it's not. And you get the same stuff for World War One, World War Two, and all the conflicts. We're fighting communists, we're fighting terrorists, we're civilizing savages. It's some stupid excuse for naked aggression.
Yep, it's always that's the excuse to go in and take monopolize markets, take over the world, and that's what
War is always by deception.
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, thank you. It's the ANCreport.com.
Yeah.
ANC Report. That's where you can see Ryan's work. You can also see his books he's written, which is, I guess, the most recent is The Separation of Business and State, which
Separation of Business and State. I also co-authored a book called Why Peace.
Why Peace.
It's co-authored by a number of people, but that's over 600 pages. I highly recommend it. People have had very emotional reactions reading that. People have cried. Because you hear, it's voices from the voiceless, that book. And I don't get any royalties for that or anything. I just contributed to it freely. Not knowing how successful it would be. No. But I had to put it down because I was like, whew. You hear some of the stories. It's not as emotional as Hellstorm, but there was one story about Cambodia there's the stuff in there that just doesn't make the news. The fumigation in Colombia and what's happening, stories that ought to be told that aren't. We kind of focus on the big wars. The war in Iraq, obviously horrible, hundreds of thousands, possibly a million people dead from that. But there are other smaller conflicts where 30,000 people killed here, 20,000 here, that just get brushed under the rug and aren't even talked about at all. And so, Why Peace? It's a big, thick book, and it's perspectives from, I think, 55 different countries. You have different authors. I was Japan's, and one of them, and you get soldiers, you have victims of war, people who participated in the war, you've got politicians, like everything. And you hear their side and what they had to go through, what veterans are dealing with today, what people in Fallujah had to deal with post-Fallujah, and so on. And that's a good one. And then Separation of Business and State is basically my thesis that the government has a reverse Midas touch, where everything they touch doesn't turn to gold, it turns into something else.
Yeah. Okay, well, listen, thank you. Again, ANCreport.com. Read his stuff. Watch his documentaries on YouTube. And you will
got a podcast on there, too.
They're provocative. They're edifying. Even if you don't agree with them, he always gives you something to think about. And that's something you can't sneeze at. So thank you, Ryan.
One last thing. I will be doing a AMA, Ask Me Anything, about the new film Empire Unmasked. Well, it's Ask Me Anything, so it's anything, but I hope they ask about
That's
that.
a show, yeah.
On Reddit. I don't have the date quite yet, but it'll be on Reddit. It'll be an AMA. It's the first one I've ever done. I think it's going to be entertaining.
Okay, that's good.
I may pull some people to the woodshed if I have to, but I don't mind. I always engage the public. I don't care about being who's right. I just care about what's right. And I find that dialogue's the best way. If I'm saying something dumb, someone can call me out on it, and I'll just go, okay, I've seen new evidence and change my mind. It doesn't matter to me. And a lot of people can't do that. And also, people have a hard time saying they don't know. They don't know something. But I hope that people today learned a bit more about the Civil War. You can't just dismiss the tariff issue like it was nothing. You just can't. And you can have multiple causes, and I could argue more about why it wasn't about slavery if that's the thing, but I wanted to spend the time more so explaining what happened with tariffs, because I feel like that's the more omitted portion of the narrative.
Well, the bigger, more destructive the war, the bigger the lies that are necessary to sanctify it. So.
Yeah, did you say that, or is that a quoting?
I just made that up myself, and I'm sure it's been said
Well, it's
before.
true. It's probably been said, but that's very
I'm sure
true.
it's been said before. I might have heard it. Maybe I heard it when I was halfway asleep somewhere. But no, but yeah, it's the bigger the war, the bigger the lies. That's so that's the way it
Yeah,
goes.
well, thanks for having me on. I'm
Well,
glad
thanks.
that someone caught